Rabaul breathed hot oil and damp jungle when the minute hand reached 0600 on the 18th of April, 1943. The runway glittered with the night's rain. Coral dust lifted in little ghosts as ground crewmen hauled chocks from a Mitsubishi G4M1. Betty Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto climbed the ladder with the careful economy of a man for whom ritual was second nature. His glove creaked on the rail. The lacquered scabbard of his sword tapped once against the fuselage, and a petty officer steadied it without looking up. 6 A6M0s idled in a loose line, prop-wash scribbling grit across the dispersal. This was not a combat sortie, but a timetable. Rabaul to Balalai near Bouin on Bougainville, brief remarks to frontline aviators, then back by afternoon. The itinerary, times, altitudes, waypoints, had gone by radio the day before, as it usually did. Staff had weighed the risk and argued, but the Commander-in-Chief judged the morale benefit greater than the danger. He had lived by schedules for 4 decades. War did not excuse discourtesy to men who bled for his plans. In the second bomber, Chief of Staff Matome Ugaki tightened his harness and felt the discomfort that comes when duty and doubt trade places. The G4M wore its long legs proudly, over 1,500 miles if nursed, but everyone knew how it paid for that range: no armour plate, no self-sealing tanks, light where other nations were growing heavier. Today the escort was thin because the theatre was thin. Mechanics cannibalized hangar queens to keep 6 Zeros serviceable. The weather broke in slow rips as a rain squall dragged past the bay. The lead bomber rolled, tail lifting, wings shouldering humid air. Wheels tucked up like a secret. The second Betty followed, lighter by ceremony and habit. The Zeros slid into a protective pattern, and the formation took the outbound leg like handwriting along the edge of the sea. Below, jungle steamed after rain. Beyond it, the interior of Bougainville glowed a hard, wet green. No one aboard expected American fighters to trouble this route. The Solomon's water distance was a moat, and the Zero's legend still generated its own weather of respect and fear. If danger came, it would be a coast watcher's radio whisper or a chance meeting with a patrol too curious for its own good. An ambush timed to a minute and sprung at treetop height was not within the accepted arithmetic of the morning. The mission's safety rested on numbers: speed, fuel, radius, and on the assumption that those numbers could not be bent by an enemy who, by all logic, lacked the reach. Ugaki closed his eyes and pictured the reception line at Balalai. He would bow to squadron leaders who wore fatigue and pride in equal measure, would speak of endurance and sharpened will, would make the gentle joke he had practiced about the hardships of travel, and would watch faces lift by inches. That was the point of this flight. Courage, like rice, had to be distributed, otherwise it spoiled. The navigator called small corrections. The Admiral rested a hand on his map board and felt the engine's tremor vibrate through paper and bone. He had taught himself to think in arcs and hours, to measure what could be carried and what could be found. The Pacific was an equation, and he trusted his sums. He had trusted them at Pearl Harbor and at Midway, and in the grinding months since. Trust is the last indulgence a commander can afford, and often the only one he can keep. On the Zero radios, voices were clipped and respectful. One pilot mentioned a loose cowl fastener. Another noted a faint smell of gasoline that was probably nothing. The leader reviewed the descent profile to Balalai, the altitude to keep the bombers comfortable and the speed to keep the fighters perches. Escort duty rewarded patience and punished ego. They would do it by the book, because the book had been written by experience and paid for in letters home. The sky opened like a stage curtain and the coastline drew itself in sharp ink. Villages revealed themselves as thin threads of smoke beyond coconut trees. The Admiral's watch ticked with the indifferent fidelity of a metronome. There would be tea, there would be words, there would be the return flight that reminded scattered garrisons their war still had a brain and that the brain was paying attention. What the formation could not see, what no one on those 2 bombers and 6 fighters could have seen, was a second set of sums already in motion, plotted in another room by men the Admiral had never met. Their geometry bent along a low path south of the horizon, where whitecaps shredded themselves under propwash and salt-flecked windshields. They were not supposed to be there. The range tables, the doctrine, the comfortable myths said so. But another nation had learned to manufacture minutes, and those minutes were now sliding toward the Admiral at the speed of twin-engine thunder. Beyond the nose-glass, the morning broadened, a pale road unspooling over the sea, promising routine and demanding nothing more than punctuality. On Guadalcanal the light came harsh and fast, striking the scabbed coral of Cookham and Henderson Field until every dent shone. Major John W. Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, knelt on a plywood table with a grease pencil and a navigator's ruler. He drew a line from the north coast of Guadalcanal to a point off Bougainville, and then broke that line into angles like a carpenter cutting trim. Time on target, 0935. Approach, wave top, radio silent. Exit, southeast at full power, then home before the gauges turned treacherous. The message that made this possible lay folded in a manila envelope weighted with a wrench. Magic, the Allied cryptanalytic effort, had read a Japanese signal that set Admiral Yamamoto's itinerary by the minute, takeoff from Rabaul, descent to Balalai, the number of bombers and escorts. The decrypt would not be shouted. It moved by hand from headquarters to Mitchell, with the quiet of a promise and a threat. He asked the Navy for a good compass, and got one, heavy enough to dent the table when a sailor set it down. Mitchell knew dead reckoning in theory. Today it would be doctrine. Compass courses, leg times, sun angles, sea state drift corrections. A low-level geometry to appear where no American fighter had any business appearing. He tapped the watch on his wrist, not because he doubted it, but because in air war you measured life in minutes and then in seconds. 18 Lockheed P-38 G Lightnings would go, 4 in the killer element, 12 as high cover, 2 as spares ready to slide into any gap. The Lightning was a strange beauty, twin booms, tricycle gear, a central nacelle with an armament layout that made gunnery simple. 4.50 caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon all in the nose meant no convergence math, no guessing where lines might meet. The stumbling block was fuel, and the solution looked like a bodge. Standard 165-gallon drop tanks were available in numbers. A shipment of 310-plus-gallon tanks had come in like an answered prayer. Mitchell's crews would hang one of each under the wings, an asymmetric pair that would have to be managed with care until they were jettisoned. Pilots rehearsed the transfer sequences out loud. Burn from the big one first, watch the ball, trim out the pull. 2 spares stood ready because things fail. A Lightning could cough a supercharger, blister a tire on coral, or sprout a fuel leak as casual as sweat. If one bird dropped, a spare would take its place and the timing would hold. At the revetments, crew chiefs moved with the rude tenderness of men who knew a machine's moods. Someone hammered a stubborn clamp around a big tank until the metal sang, and the pilot under the wing grinned despite himself. High-octane fumes mixed with the smell of spilled coffee and red dirt. Mitchell briefed in sentences as spare as the fuel margins. Radio silence except for one code word. Climb only when the navigation legs said to climb. Top cover would float high to catch the zeros. The killers would stay low and fast for the bombers. Miss the time, and you missed the man. Consider him a very senior officer, Mitchell said, and moved on. He reserved a lie for the outside world. If anyone asked later, the Coast Watchers had seen a VIP flight, full stop. The truth, that an American democracy could fuse code work, logistics and nerve to send fighters 1,000 miles for one man, would stay locked in a safe. At 0725 the first P-38 rolled, tail high, engines in the green. Another followed, and another. A blown tyre forced one to limp to a stop. A spare slid forward without drama and took the slot. That was the point. Machines fail and plans continue. By the time the last bird lifted, the formation was a moving clock face pointing north. The impossible part, the part their enemy trusted, was range. American factories had turned distance into a solvable problem. The numbers would never be printed on the mission orders, but every pilot knew them by feel. Production lines that could replace a lost fighter in days, drop tanks arriving by the crate, spares for the spares. They were about to spend minutes like a rich nation spends coins and expect change. The 347th Fighter Group flew out of Rough Coral and PSP, its maintenance tents stitched with safety wire and hope. Pilots wore Mae Wests and pistols they rarely drew. What mattered were maps greased soft from folding and the habit of checking manifold pressure by feel. Mitchell reminded the killers, Rex T. Barber, Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. and their wingmen, that centerline guns meant no convergence guesswork. 2 Allison V-1710s would haul each Lightning low and fast. Superchargers would not matter at this altitude, but radiator shutters would. Jettison the tanks only when the merge demanded it. Trim for the asymmetric loads and watch the ball. Over water, the Lightnings became shadows. The formation dropped to wave height until whitecaps flashed past the wingtips like thrown knives, and the ocean's skin turned the windshields to salt fog. Rex T. Barber flew with his toes light on the rudder, feeling the pull of the large drop tank drag at the wing, and then the trim tab cancel it a heartbeat later. The rule was simple and merciless. Keep it low, keep it quiet, keep it on time. Dead reckoning is a plain phrase that hides how much sweat it costs. Mitchell's geometry lived now as headings tapped into memory, leg times counted against a wristwatch that every pilot checked without looking down, sun angle noted on the back of an envelope and then carried in the head. The ocean offered no landmarks, only the long march of white line after white line. Pilots took bearings on cloud shadows and the feel of crosswind on a cheek. Occasionally someone glanced left or right and, seeing nothing but spray and the glittering, pitiless flat, felt the gentle bite of fear. A P-38 in this regime is part fish, part knife. The Allison V-1710s turned steady, mixture leaned for range, the props etched twin halos in the sea mist. Ammunition counts were plain, roughly 500 rounds per .50 and only seconds of 20mm. Miss and You had only the cold comfort of speed left. 2 aircraft fell out early. One blew a tyre on Coral and limped clear. Another showed a sick fuel flow and taxied in. The spares slid forward without a word, the formation knitting itself tight again, as if the gap had never opened. This was abundance at the tactical level. Redundancy flown as discipline. The sea changed colour as currents braided, the horizon lifted into a pale line. Shortland and Treasury Islands were off the left shoulder by calculation, not by sight. A shadow banked across the water. Mitchell eased the throttle to keep the clock honest. The plan called for a climb only when the leg toward Bougainville demanded it, and that demand would come on a minute that had been written down before the sun rose. Barber glanced at the ball, at the compass card, at the second hand. He would have considered one impossible statistic the newspapers never printed. In 1943, the United States would build roughly 85,000 aircraft, while Japan built around 16,000. Those numbers were not on his knee board, but they were in the crates that had delivered the big tanks, in the spare airframes parked under camouflage nets, in the quiet certainty that a blown tyre didn't cancel a mission. A single factory line back home could turn out more engines in a month than some enemy plants mated to airframes in a quarter. That arithmetic rode with them as surely as the extra compass. The ocean began to smell of land, an illusion perhaps, but pilots swore they could taste jungle before they saw it. Wind lanes slicked the surface, flying fish stitched arcs and vanished. A fragment of palm trunk bobbed, then spun away in the prop wash. Even a cylinder's cough was private, felt in the teeth more than heard. Mitchell raised 2 fingers in the cockpit, climb, and the killer element eased higher while the top cover separated to its appointed altitude like a ghost echo of the same machine. The formation was a set of clock hands now, long, all pointed at a minute not yet arrived. Barber flexed his right hand. His glove was damp with sweat. He thought of his wingman and then refused to think further. The coastline revealed itself as a darker green inside the dawn haze, Bougainville throwing its own weather up into the sky. The plan said they should see nothing until they saw everything. That was the nature of ambush. The last fuel checks were a recital: burn the big tank dry, switch, balance, trim. They would jettison the tanks only when the merge demanded it, not 1 second sooner, because steel was insurance against surprises, and even the best plan has to survive the last 5 minutes. The minute arrived the way all minutes do, quietly, and then changed everything. Mitchell's canopy caught a flash off metal ahead. Specks ripened into shapes, 2 bombers, 6 fighters, all descending into a line that would intersect with the Americans' climb. The ocean, the clocks, the angles, the sentences in a codebook no one would mention aloud. Everything converged into a strip of sky ahead, no wider than a road. Mitchell clicked his mic at last. Top cover up, killers in, keep it tight. They saw each other almost at once, 2 Betty bombers with 6 Zero escorts descending toward Balalai and 18 P-38G Lightnings unfolding like a drawn ambush from the sea. Top cover up, killers in, keep it tight. The formation divided as planned, the 12 high cover climbing to meet the Zeros and the killer element, Barber, Lanphier and their wingmen, keeping low, fast and mean for the bombers. Barber trimmed out the last tug of the big tank and held the line. Every lesson in gunnery came down to seconds and the P-38's gift. All guns in the nose, no convergence, no guessing across a fan of trajectories. Close and write your name. He saw the lead Betty's engines silver in the sun as it descended into a shallow right turn. That would be the staff plane, he thought, while the Admiral rode in the second. When the bombers began their check turn for approach, the Americans pushed throttles and distance collapsed. Above and behind, Zeros rolled into the high cover with practiced grace. In the first split seconds, one clung to the tail of a climbing Lightning, only to be flipped off when the American jinked and his wingman cut across with a burst that stitched air. The Japanese pilots fought with discipline. They were not surprised by battle, only by geography. Americans were here at all. Lanphier broke left to drive a wedge between the escorts and the bombers, then hauled back to present the top cover with a gift, a 0-1 mistake from disaster. Barber kept straight for the second bomber, the one descending harder as if to brush the treetops. Betty crews often dropped low when threatened. Trees make poor backstops for bullets. His thumb found the gun button and the Lightning began to speak. The first burst reached too far. He managed his impatience, lifted the nose a thumb's width, and the next stream of 50 and 20 mm walked in from the right engine toward the cockpit. The bomber flashed past the edge of his windscreen and slid into the jungle like a train entering a tunnel. Leaves rose in a green sigh and then fell as if the forest had inhaled and chosen not to exhale. In that same breath, the staff bomber took hits and went to the sea. Men would later be pulled alive from the water, their shock preserved in memory. On the American side, a P-38, Raymond K. Hines, trailed smoke and fell away toward the coast, silent. Victory, even when tidy on a map, smears at the edges in the air. The merge scattered the high cover into tight, ugly fights. Zeros clawed for angles, trying to trade altitude for position. The Lightnings climbed in short bites and then slid out when their weight began to tell. The P-38 was no ballerina, but it could dive and recover with authority. Each pilot fought to convert seconds into survival. Each mistake cost altitude. A Zero drilled a row of holes in a Lightning's left boom and then overshot into a slap of .50 that ruined its day without quite ending it. Barber banked and searched the green. He would later say he never saw the Admiral, only the bomber that must have carried him. War turns certainty into paperwork. What mattered in the hour was that the ambush had worked to the minute and the sky now belonged to the Americans long enough to leave. Mitchell called the turn for home in a voice that sounded to Barber like someone setting a coffee cup on a table. That ordinary, that final, killer's egress, top cover, stay mean and keep them honest. The surviving Zero pilots pressed a last exchange and then, low on fuel and options, broke off toward the strip. The Americans jettisoned empty tanks and formed into the outbound legs of a plan that still had to carry them 1,000 miles. Behind them, a thin pillar of smoke rose inland and vanished into the canopy. Somewhere below, villagers would have heard the ripping thunder and the long quiet after. On the seaside, the foam scars of a crash melted within minutes, leaving only fuel slicks that caught the sun and then went dull. Above, the lightnings levelled to cruise, and silence fell into the headsets as if the radio had dreamed the fight. No one spoke of codes, no one said the name they all suspected. They counted minutes and fuel instead. The homeward legs would punish any pilot who confused ambition with range. Mitchell glanced once at the compass he had borrowed from the Navy and allowed himself a private nod. The line he had drawn across the ocean before dawn had become a set of contrails tying a morning's arithmetic to the fall of a single airplane. The jungle did not so much receive the bomber as absorb it. Barber held the burst for a count he had practiced, 2 Mississippi, and then saw the right engine, cough smoke, the nose dip, and the whole shape vanish into green. He held course for a few seconds more, unwilling to trust the eye until the mind believed it, and only then eased left to scan the canopy for fire that did not come. Betties could burn like paper lanterns when tanks ruptured, but the ground sometimes smothered flame. Today the forest kept its own counsel. Out toward the sea, the staff plane, already wounded, stalled into a long curve and struck in a burst of spray that went white, then pink, then white again. Men tumbled into the water. A Zero circled, then broke off when a lightning probed the turn. On the American side, a contrail of brown smoke thinned from Raymond K. Hines' P-38 until it became a thought rather than a line. No answer. His wingman called once more and then saved his fuel for the long ride home. The minutes after a merge are work. Mitchell's top cover kept the Zeros honest while the killers reassembled from their runs. Barber checked his ammunition. Only seconds of 20mm left, a few hundred rounds in the Brownings, enough to warn but not to waste. Oil temp, cylinder head, fuel pressure, inside the lines for now. Below, Bougainville's southern coast lay hot and black-green. In villages near Bouin, people would have looked up at the thunder and then gone still when it ended. A Japanese search party would hack at lianas, following a smear of branches toward a smell of fuel and metal. The story that made its way back to Tokyo within days was simple and unbearable. Yamamoto had been found beneath a tree, still strapped in, his wounds fatal. Ugaki, thrown from the staff bomber and pulled from the sea, would keep his diary like a penance. He recorded what he could and left out what he must. An empire needed a version of events that would hold. Official communiques were careful, shrouding times and places. The men who had dived into the water talked about wings, the sound of American guns, and a sky full of enemies 1 minute and empty the next. Back on Guadalcanal, the debrief room smelled of wet canvas, coffee and burned powder. The interrogator's pencil hovered over forms with the right blanks, time, altitude, ammunition, while the words that mattered most were never written. Coast watchers reported a VIP, someone said on cue. It would have been true enough in other battles. Today it served a greater truth that needed darkness to keep working. The technicians who had tightened clamps on the big drop tanks counted success by different math. 18 had gone, and 18, minus Hine, would return. The airplanes would be hosed free of salt, inspected, and rearmed. The asymmetric tanks had done their job. Burn the big one first, watch the ball, jettison only when the fight demanded. Pilots traded small advice that sounded like superstition, but came from hours in cockpits. Drink water before takeoff, or you'll forget to during. Speak softly on the radio. Nerves travel in voices. Barber replayed the run, as men always do when they have survived something that asked them a final question. Did he fire too early on the first pass? Did the lift vector wander when he trimmed out the last pull from the big tank? He denied himself the mercy of perfect hindsight and laid the minutes down in order until they were a path he could walk. He would write letters, there were always letters, including one to Heinz people that would say little and mean everything. Over Bougainville, the forest settled again into its work. Fuel evaporated into a smell that would linger for days. Metal cooled. Insects reclaimed their soundscape. A party of villagers would stand at a distance and decide there was nothing they could do. Out on the sea, a patch of floating debris twisted and scattered, bright and gone. Barber pushed his throttle a little and closed on Mitchell's wing, the ocean rising and falling beneath them in slow breaths. The gauges gave their assurances: fuel, temps, pressure. The mission still had to be flown home. The ambush had worked, but the calendar was not finished with April, and a nation's factory floors were still beating time, so that 18 planes could become 17, and the arithmetic of a free people could continue to pay for minutes no enemy thought possible. The first truth to be written down was not the truth that mattered. Back at Guadalcanal, in a hot room that smelled of dry paper and damp canvas, airmen filled in boxes: time of intercept, altitude, enemy types, ammunition expended. Coast watchers reported a VIP flight, the narrative began, and from there the story walked itself along a safe rut. Codes do their best work when no one knows they exist. A Navy officer in khaki took the thin folder that actually mattered and slid it into a safe with a practiced hand. Magic had given them the minute. It would not be named. Mitchell allowed himself a glance at the borrowed compass, set it on the table for inventory, and signed where a line demanded ink. Barber answered questions with the same restraint he used on the trigger. Range to target when he fired? Close enough to see the walkway of tracers. Duration of burst? 2 seconds on the first, a hair longer on the second. Damage observed? The bomber descended into the trees. He avoided claims, avoided the gravity that surrounds names, and kept to the lane pilots trust most, what instruments and eyes agreed upon. Elsewhere, a clerk drew up citation drafts that would sit while seniors debated phrasing, how to honour men without teaching the enemy. Tokyo's story travelled more slowly, riding on couriers and caution. Search parties on Bougainville made their reports in tones that tried to be military and could not help being human. Ugaki lived. The commander-in-chief did not. Notices that reached families trimmed place and time until grief fit inside a paragraph. Behind those words, a realization stalked. The enemy had either found a way to fly further than expected or had known the schedule. Either answer wounded. Range was the explanation men could say out loud, and range they had seen with their own eyes. The Lightning's twin Allisons had carried Americans to a rendezvous Japan had considered unreachable. Drop tanks, 165s paired with 310s, made cold math pliable. Those numbers sound small next to the ocean until you stitch them to factories. In 1943 alone, the United States would build roughly 85,000 aircraft, while Japan would produce about 16,000. A single stateside engine line could, in some months, turn out more power plants than an enemy plant could mount on wings. This was the secret behind the secret. Cryptanalysis bent time, industry bent distance. The cover story travelled outward as discipline. Reporters on rear bases heard only that coast watchers had spotted a VIP and that American fighters, by skill and luck, had been on hand to do their duty. Somewhere, a public affairs officer crossed out a sentence that strayed too close to the sun. Medals would be approved at a deliberate pace. Awards boards would argue points of credit with a lawyer's care because language itself could leak. Within the 347th Fighter Group, the news tasted like victory and like loss. Pilots nodded at Barber without ceremony, slapped Mitchell on the shoulder about his borrowing habits, then went quiet when someone said Hines' name. Air War always writes in a ledger that contains columns the public never sees. 1 airplane gone. 1 man gone. 18 went out, 17 came back. Barber sat under a wing and wrote a letter that began with facts and ended with an apology he could not justify and could not avoid. In Tokyo, senior officers faced a different arithmetic. If the enemy knew schedules, then every timetable had to be rewritten, every signal path hardened, every escort strengthened. But fighters were finite. Fuel was finite. Moving a flag officer would now cost a squadron's worth of sorties the Empire could not spare. Even if codes were sound, American reach had to be treated as a new constant. Escorts would tighten, altitudes would vary, and messages would shorten until they read like telegrams to fate. The ambush had lasted minutes. Its consequences would last for months, measured in postponed inspections, in restless staff meetings, in pilots who scanned lower and further than habit once required. Mitchell's men did not speak of legacy. They ate, slept, and checked the same aircraft for the same leaks, and they prepared to fly again because systems absorb even the sharpest days and keep moving. In 1 year, a free nation would outbuild its foe by roughly 5 to 1 in aircraft alone. Secrecy simply pointed that weight like a finger. The search began with machetes and silence. On the southern shoulder of Bougainville, men from a Japanese naval landing party pushed into the green heat where a bomber had disappeared as if the island had inhaled it. The jungle clung to everything: sweat, cloth, memory, and even a gasoline smell seemed to move away when grasped. They followed a ragged lane of snapped branches and shredded fronds that pointed like a crooked arrow into thicker brush. A petty officer kept a notebook dry beneath oilskin and wrote little phrases that sounded official because anything weaker would have slid off the leaves. Villagers watched at a respectful distance, eyes tracking uniforms and machetes with the assessment people acquire when wars visit but do not ask permission. A boy pointed once toward a stand of taller trees where birds had not returned. A chief nodded without speaking. The party moved on. The air felt like a hand. Mosquitoes settled and lifted as a single creature. The petty officer paused to fold his map and got the wand of a dragonfly in the face, its glassy wings beating a rhythm that felt profane in a place devoted to a different silence. They found the first aluminum late in the morning, an access panel wedged among buttress roots, paint scoured by the passage. Farther on, a strip of skin with rivet lines lay curled like a dead fish. Then the path steepened and ended at a shallow ravine where the undergrowth had been slammed flat. 2 propeller blades were buried in dark earth at angles that told a story without words. A fuselage section lay broken across a root, the metal bent like paper. In the shade beneath the largest tree sat the remains the party had been warned they might find, still harnessed, wounds unmistakable, the uniform arranged by violence into a parody of rest. No one spoke. The petty officer's hands shook once and stopped. He wrote what duty required and set aside what grief wanted. They did what culture demanded. A tarp went up, a perimeter formed. The petty officer took the sword from the scabbard with both palms and set it aside with care. He wrote in the notebook and did not write certain names. The party had rehearsed reactions to many possibilities. This one they recognized from the first look at the face. The record would move slowly, guarded by euphemism. Tokyo would be told by couriers before the city was told by rumor. In the meantime, a small Pacific island held a secret the size of an empire. Back along the coast, another team moved toward the sea crash site where the staff bomber had gone in. Debris spread in a thin necklace along the shore. A seat frame, a hatch, a flight glove waterlogged into the shape of a hand. Survivors had been pulled from the water earlier that day by comrades whose fuel clocks had room for courage. They said the Americans had seemed to rise out of the ocean and vanish the same way. Range, someone muttered, as though the word itself could make sense of distance. In Rabaul, signals officers clipped verbs and dates until their reports looked like telegrams to the future. Escort doctrine would be amended. Schedules, once written like temple calendars, would now flex and bend. It would not change the past hour by an inch, but it would train men to imagine enemies arriving from. Directions that had previously existed only as theory. The search party cut a stretcher from saplings and canvas and began the slow return, shoulders burning, forearms striped with cuts where living things defended their edges. Near dusk, the line of men stepped from jungle to beach, and the world shifted to openness and reflected sky. The petty officer faced the water a moment before giving orders. He had seen battle lines in textbooks and now saw them on a horizon. Out there sat the mathematics that had arranged this day. Machines with legs longer than anyone had admitted, a chain of decisions that began in rooms he would never enter, a nation capable of spending minutes the way his navy spent prayers. He felt something like respect and chose a straighter word: fear. On Guadalcanal, the machines were counted and the men were fed, and what could be fixed before sundown would fly at dawn. The mission filed itself into the ledger, and the ledger had many columns because a democracy likes to measure. Crew chiefs rinsed salt from P-38 skins and ran fingers along rivet lines to feel for loosened heads. Armourers wiped feed trays and counted links into belts that would thread nose guns like arguments. A maintenance corporal recorded how long it had taken to swap a generator and whether the new gasket wept. This was victory from below, solvent on rags, safety wire cut and twisted, a torque wrench's soft click. Mitchell walked the revetments and saw what leadership looks like after headlines leave. Safety wire like neat stitches, pins square to cotter holes, fuel caps seated, the quiet competence of men who would never sign a communiqué. He knew that what they had done would have been impossible without labour upstream. Somewhere far beyond the palms, factory windows glowed at midnight. Somewhere a railway siding received crates stencilled with tank capacities, and a supply clerk, who could not fly, made sure the digits matched the manifest. The numbers are not poetry, but they sing if you learn the tune. Lockheed would build on the order of 10,000 P-38s. Mitsubishi would turn out roughly 2,400 G-4M Betty bombers total. In 1943 alone, American factories produced approximately 86,000 aircraft. Japan, something like 16,000. A ratio like that does not merely tilt battlefields. It bends strategy around itself like heat miraging a road. Pilots did not speak in these figures, but they lived in them every time a spare slid into formation when another bird faltered. At a stateside plant, a woman in a headscarf leaned into a rivet gun until the webbing on her wrists rubbed raw, because rates mattered. A foreman posted a chart that showed how many hours it took to install a wing spar last month and how many it took this month. The government printed pamphlets with odd titles: War Production Reports, Index of Effort, and a machinist in Detroit who had never seen an ocean watched a red line climb past a number that, translated into airframes, meant squadrons. At Kukum, the heroic and the mundane lay side by side like tools in a canvas roll. A radio man rewired a connector because salt is a persistent enemy. A pilot checked his Mae West for leaks and his pistol for the same reason men have checked pistols since cavalry. Learned saddles. A squadron clerk typed an after-action report that would be filed and forgotten, except that years later someone would open it and recognize the shape of a morning that changed a war's posture by degrees. Mitchell spoke briefly to Barber and Lanphier because good commanders use few words when men are tired. He noted credit without fastening it to names that could not be safely spoken. He did not need to mention range. The tanks had already taught that lesson. He did ask if the borrowed Navy compass had behaved, and when the answer came back yes, he smiled the smile of a man whose small favour bought a large result. A message from higher headquarters arrived on onion skin. Well done, then lines about discretion and preparation. The unit would return to normal duties. There would be other missions, more minutes to be manufactured. The victory would be honoured in private, parcelled into ribbons at a rate set by men who understood both valour and caution. Night on Guadalcanal comes with a choir of insects and the glow of cigarettes cupped in hands. The men talked softly about small things, mail, shoes, a rumour of coffee at the Seabees dump, because talk about the big thing attracts lightning. The lightnings themselves loomed in the dark like sharks pulled ashore, their twin booms throwing long shadows. Somewhere in that gloom, a mechanic lay on a creeper and tightened a bolt to torque, exactly as the manual suggested. Abundance at scale is not just a heap of parts, it is a habit enforced across a civilization. The difference between victory and disaster can be the minutes a factory saves on a jig change or a clerk's insistence that serial numbers match bills of lading. The morning's intercept had looked like courage at the tip. In the long view, it showed as system. The island slept badly, but it slept, and when engines coughed to life before dawn, there was nothing miraculous about it. Miracles repeated become procedure. By the end of the week, there was a new page tacked to the corkboard in a hot tent, long-range intercept, Pacific. It was not poetry, it was a recipe. Approach at wave height. Radio silence except for the single execute word. Compass calibration with Navy pattern where available. Asymmetric drop tank employment, 310, then 165, jettison on merge. Time on target tolerance plus or minus 2 minutes. The page bore the fingerprints of operations sergeants and the authority of men who had flown the line. Doctrine grows where experience cuts channels, and Operation Vengeance cut a deep one. Intelligence officers refined how decrypts were phrased for pilots, strip adjectives, keep verbs, print times in large font. Navigators built leg cards that fit into kneeboards without a fold. The cards listed speeds, magnetic headings, fuel transfer sequences, and contingencies for bad weather. A planner scrawled an unlovely truth at the bottom of one card, arrive at the minute, and underlined it twice. The Japanese adjusted too. Signals officers in Rabaul shortened messages and varied phrasing to frustrate traffic analysis. VIP itineraries would be kept in tighter compartments. Escorts would be scheduled heavier, which was to say other missions would be starved. Discipline multiplied across a system already taught. Pilots who once believed distance their ally began to feel the ocean as a chessboard rather than a moat. They would have respected the Americans more if respect were not already worn thin by attrition. In the squadron area, a corporal in supply built a plywood box for the borrowed Navy compasses because if you want precision, you must store it like it is precious. Mechanics made a ritual for asymmetric tanks, a chalk mark on the big cap and a fingertip swipe to confirm the feed. Crew chiefs briefed pilots in a language of glances that said, "We have tested this thing to the limit, and it will hold if you will hold." That is how democracies fight, by distributing responsibility until failure has nowhere to sit. The lesson filtered outward to other wings. Low-level ingress profiles appeared in briefings across the South Pacific, and the odd pairing of tank sizes stopped being a trick and became standard. Training flights rehearsed, believing a line on a map would end at another airplane's shadow. Pilots learned to fly by minutes more than by miles. Their vocabulary thickened with the math of IAS and TAS, with compass variation, with the new habit of reading wind on whitecaps and trusting the readout of their own discipline. Every third sentence could have carried an impossible statistic. In some mid-year weeks, American factories pushed out aircraft at a pace that meant more airframes in 7 days than Japan could finish in a month. In a single month, one engine plant could complete more V-1710s than some enemy regions could mount under wings in a quarter. You could argue details with a clerk, you could not argue the curve of the lines. Production became doctrine's shadow, and doctrine moved faster because industry ran hot. Barber wrote to Hein's family as promised, the letter clean of bravado and heavy with the respect pilots reserve for those who did not make it home. He did not mention magic because secrets kept men alive. He did write the truth as he knew it. Your son flew well, did his duty, and was last seen fighting his airplane toward the coast. Around him, other men wrote letters that talked about coffee, rain on canvas, and a pair of boots that had given up the ghost. At dusk, Mitchell walked past the revetments and listened to engines settling after test runs. He considered how much of command was timing and how much was trust. He had been given numbers that a nation manufactured in anonymity and had linked them to men who could turn minutes into outcomes. That was his job, and he had done it, and now his job was to do it again without spending men where procedure could spend fuel instead. On Bougainville, villagers returned to gardens after the search parties left, and the jungle laid green over the damage with its usual indifference. In Tokyo, uniforms whispered near doors that stayed closed for longer than protocol required. In Washington, a safe absorbed another memo with a label meant to outlast trends. The intercept had become doctrine, and doctrine, when fed by an industrial river, becomes something greater than the sum of courage. It becomes reliability, and reliability is how you win oceans. The ledger settled in quiet hours, when the air cooled enough that coffee tasted like something other than survival. Mitchell opened the days, forms and saw columns for fuel, ammunition, flying hours, engine cycles, tyres, spark plugs, and one line that never read easy: missing. He was a combat commander, but also a bookkeeper in a war where arithmetic could comfort or condemn. The ambush had cost one P-38 and one pilot Raymond K. Hine, a name that men spoke softly afterward. It had cost fuel, ammunition, and maintenance hours that could be replaced by factories and minutes that could not. He wrote a short memo he would never quote in public, a note to himself about how much we were willing to spend to cut a single filament in an opponent's will. Democracies keep receipts because democracies know they will be asked later, and he understood the day would come when a senator would lean forward and ask exactly how much courage costs and how many gallons it burns per minute. He would answer with the same restraint his pilots used on triggers. What could be said aloud was simpler. A timetable had been intercepted, a course had been plotted, an escort had been beaten at its own game, and an enemy admiral had died in a jungle not far from a runway built of crushed coral. That plainness masked the gears beneath. Code breakers in cramped rooms had pried a door open. Quartermasters had pushed crates through that door. Mechanics had made sure the contents fit to the bolt. Pilots had lifted the whole contraption and carried it like a gift to the only address that mattered. Halsey's headquarters sent word that honours would be prepared at a pace consistent with discretion. Intelligence signalled that cover stories would hold. The 13th Air Force reminded units that victory does not excuse sloppiness and that sloppiness kills just as dead as enemy fire. Mitchell added his own injunctions to the squadron board, the kind that make veterans nod and recruits roll their eyes: hydrate before wheels up, rehearse fuel transfer, speak softly on the radio, trust time. In Tokyo, the effect could be measured only by inference. Escorts assigned to senior movements doubled or were cancelled. Itineraries went vague. The hum around cipher rooms changed from efficient to brittle. You could tell when a system was afraid by how many new procedures it stapled to old ones. Ugaki, living with survivor's duty, wrote entries that said less than they meant. Pilots in Zero squadrons checked their watches more often and did their math twice. They began to treat the ocean as a place where the enemy could appear not only from ahead, but also from the unlikely corners of a map. Mitchell sat with Barber and Lanfear at a table rough enough to snag sleeves and asked them the question only operators can ask each other: what would you change? They answered in the language of men who have thought hard about seconds. Enter a hair higher to buy a slice of gravity on the brake. Hold the big tank 10 more miles if nerves allow. The compass behaved, the leg cards were sound, the top cover split felt right. Their conclusion was not heroism, it was craft. He composed the condolence for Hine's family with the care of a man writing a will he hoped no one would need. He used dates, times, and the respectful correctness of rank and unit designations because names deserve to be held firmly in language. He did not promise more than truth could bear. He did write the one sentence families need most. He was not alone. At night he walked the line once more and touched the cool skin of a P-38's boom, as if to reassure himself that metal still obeyed hands. The stars over Guadalcanal were heavy with humidity and looked closer than maps suggested. Somewhere out there, he knew, a staff officer on the other side was tabulating, drawing boxes around vulnerable habits. The war was not a story that ended with a crash site. It was a story that used crash sites as punctuation. He thought of the borrowed compass, of a clock face across the ocean, and of a nation that could afford to keep minutes in stock. News moves unevenly in war. On Tulagi and Guadalcanal, Marines tacked a short newspaper item to a mess hall board and grinned without ceremony. It happened on the first anniversary of the Doolittle raid, someone said, and that seemed right. In Tokyo, the announcement arrived with silk over steel, the language respectful to the point of reverence and cautious as a man walking a beam. Across the Pacific, the same fact carried different weights. In one place, a proof that distance could be bent. In another, a reminder that timetables could be traps. For the Americans, the intercept confirmed something they had begun to suspect after months of learning the hard way. That range and timing could be made into a weapon as sharp as any bomb. Pilots traded quiet jokes about borrowing Navy compasses as if visiting the neighbours for sugar. Intelligence officers, who rarely earned applause, allowed themselves one night of satisfaction before tightening the screws again. They knew a cover story had to be tended like a garden. Coast watchers would get the credit because stories need faces people can safely look at. For Japanese naval air units, the shock expressed itself in procedures. A senior officer's travel meant more escorts and shorter legs. Schedules acquired elastic where once they had bone. Radio operators learned to cut out all but the necessary. Pilots, many of them equal in skill to any they faced, burned fuel-fighting anxiety as well as enemies. Respect for the foe, already present, began to calcify into caution at the corners. That is not cowardice. It is what happens when a system senses it has met an opponent who can appear on the minute. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, staff officers used the event to argue for things they wanted anyway. More aircraft ferries, more drop tank production, more training hours in low-level navigation. The intercept had been a tactical triumph and a propaganda dividend, but to professionals it was also a memorandum written in smoke. The marriage of signals and range could rewrite calendars. It was not enough to have fighters and codebreakers. They had to be arranged so a captain in a tent could borrow a compass and reach across an ocean. The effects were not all strategy and procedure. In barracks, men looked at the empty bunk of Raymond K. Hine and understood the cost column without being told. Letters went out in envelopes with no hint of secrecy and every hint of finality. The squadron adopted one of the small rituals units use when grief needs a shape. A cup left untouched at the end of the table for a week, then cleared without a word. A. Zero pilot who had rolled into the fight that morning would have told friends later that he had never expected to see Americans appear from that direction at that height on that minute. He would not blame his machine. The A6M was a thoroughbred at the right altitude. He would not blame his mates. They had fought as they had been taught. He would say the enemy had studied the board and moved a night where a night should not go. The metaphor would be imperfect, but the admission pure. On stateside factory floors, the news made a different sense. A riveter learned, in a single sentence, that something she had drilled last month had flown 1,000 miles and changed a map. She adjusted her earplugs and made the next hole. A foreman ran a fingertip down a clipboard, thought about a boy he had coached who was now far away, and made a note to reorder clamps before they were down to last box. It is a virtue of democracy that ordinary effort can carry extraordinary consequence when multiplied by millions. On Bougainville, the villagers went back to gardens and fishing. The jungle, unmoved, drew vines slowly across metal until even bright aluminum dulled to a colour the forest approved. War's aftermath is not an epilogue for the people who live where it happened. It is a chore list. A path needs clearing, a canoe needs patching, a child needs a story that does not teach too much fear. The Intercept's echo did not shout, it hummed. It hummed in convoy schedules adjusted by an hour. It hummed in training syllabi that added the sentence about arriving at the minute. It hummed when a commander in Tokyo chose to stay put rather than fly, and when a planner in the South Pacific approved an extra shipment of big drop tanks without being asked. The event sat in men's heads as a weight on the scale, invisible and determinative. That is how turning points usually live in the world they turn. Pull the camera back and the map fills the wall. A thin red thread runs from Guadalcanal past Shortland to Bougainville, and a brass pin marks where a bomber went out like a candle under leaves. On the bench below, the borrowed Navy compass rests in a cardboard box, its needle quiet. Seen up close, Operation Vengeance looks like nerve. At the scale where wars are decided, it proves that a democracy can manufacture time, range, and precision until the improbable becomes routine. Start with numbers, because they are the bones of the tale. In 1943, American factories produced roughly 85 to 86,000 aircraft, about 5 for every one Japan finished that year. Lockheed's line delivered on the order of 10,000 P-38s across the war, while Mitsubishi produced roughly 2,400 G4M bombers in total. In its best months, a single American shipyard launched Liberty ship tonnage the Imperial Navy could not match hull for hull in a season. Ratios like that do not decorate stories, they drive strategy. Now zoom to the men so the numbers have voices. Mitchell knelt in coral dust and drew a line. Barber pressed the gun button twice for counts learned on stateside ranges. Lanphier split the escort to make space. The top cover kept a sky honest for as long as fuel allowed. A mechanic set torque by feel and then by the book. A clerk filed a damp form in. A tent that leaked in hard rain. A cryptanalyst chose a word that would not betray a source and sent a courier across hot tarmac. None of these acts is dramatic alone. Together they become reach on a clock. For the enemy, the lesson was exposure, not inadequacy. Japanese naval air arms did not lack skill or nerve, they lacked a margin. The A6M could dance, and the G4M could reach, but the Empire could not replace them at the pace a continent could. After Bougainville, escort plans thickened, radio habits tightened, and senior officers began to treat their own timetables as liabilities in a world where the opponent reads clocks for a living. A system built for Dash found itself needing redundancy it had not budgeted. For Americans, the ambush clarified the marriage of intelligence and logistics. Magic without range would have been a sadder story, a note pinned to a board no pilot could answer. Range without magic would have been courage thrown into fog. Fused, they let a squadron on a rough strip touch a point on a map with surgical cruelty and then vanish into sea haze. The fusion would echo forward, an early sketch of modern find-fix-finish chains in which information and steel meet on time. Remember the price, because the ledger honours as well as proves. Raymond K. Hine did not come back. His name lives in the quiet at the end of toasts and in the habit of pilots to touch a wing as they pass it in the dark. Counting does not bury the human under totals. It exists to make sure the human price buys something commensurate. Here it bought a shock that travelled from a jungle glade to conference rooms where the next year's war was drawn. By war's end, the arithmetic that killed an admiral in a jungle was everywhere. It guided carrier groups leaping across the Central Pacific by timetable, bomber streams arriving over factories on the stroke, and supply pyramids that kept rifles, chocolate bars and quinine moving to places maps had not yet learned to pronounce. The same industrial river that filled a lightning's tanks would soon enough fill relief ships. Abundance did not merely win, it taught a generation that scale and decency need not be opposites. Stand again at the wall map and trace the red thread with a fingertip. You will feel only paper, yet under that line live furnaces and lathes, chalkboards and typewriters, calloused hands, and narrow bands of courage measured in seconds. The astonishing thing is not that the Americans did it once, it is that they could schedule it for Tuesday. Totalitarian systems rarely understand this about free ones. You cannot order ingenuity, but you can invite it and equip it, and then it arrives at the minute. So the compass sleeps in its box, the map pin dulls with time, the jungle closes over aluminum and turns bright metal the colour of weather. But the logic remains. When a free people organise their knowledge, their factories and their willingness, they bend distance until a squadron can make an appointment with an enemy half an ocean away and keep it on the dot. Operation Vengeance was a single morning, a few engines, a few hundred gallons burned into speed and decision. It was also a promise that a nation of citizens, properly armed with numbers and nerve, could turn minutes into victory.